Hello, my name is Dutch Hedrick and I'm of Rube's Good Brain Coffee. We're in Kittrell, North Carolina. And I just want to talk a little bit about advice for novice roasters. Now, I don't pretend to know everything, and actually that's part of what I want to talk about today, which is there's a lot of stuff that you're going to hear as you're getting into the roasting business or just doing it as a hobby. There's a lot of things that you're going to hear, and a lot of times the information may be contradictory. So I guess first of all you should be open and be skeptical, okay? And you're going to want to do that at the same time. So as you're hearing all this new information from different people, be open to it, but also be skeptical. Because there's actually a lot of things that we're just figuring out when it comes to coffee. I started in July of 2003, and this was after about 10 years of being in the coffee business. I started roasting coffee for a well-known coffee roasters. They're nationally known now. And well, I gotta say that things back then, 15 years ago, were much different than they are today in the way they're done. Now, there's been a lot of changes in the industry. One of the things that I believe has changed the industry a lot is the advent of Roast magazine. And up until then, I mean, you did have your publications such as Coffee and Tea, that have been around since 1901, but I think they tended to maybe cater to larger, more established coffee roasters, less to third wave coffee roasting. And what I saw from Roast magazine was they were particularly catering to third wave roasting, okay? And one of the first articles I read was by a man named Willem Boot. You may have heard of him. His family has been coffee roasting for quite a while. And like I said, this is one of the first issues of Roast magazine. And what he said was, if tomorrow nobody was buying dark roasted coffees, would you be able to survive in the industry? And just that alone tells you a lot about what third wave coffee looked like back then. So roasting light was such a new idea that that's how Willem had to present his idea about roasting light coffees as. So if tomorrow nobody bought dark roasted coffees, would you be able to cope in this new reality? Okay, and there were some tips that he offered in that article, and I remember thinking, well, why don't we try this? Because one of the reasons why I was interested in coffee in the first place is because there were so many flavors to be found in light roasted coffee. So I thought, well, if we can roast coffee a bit lighter and do so successfully, then why don't we give it a try? And I was actually finding a lot of resistance among those I worked with. And at a certain point, I remember thinking, why don't I just try it? Let me try it. And I would do 2 roasts. Now these batches were 132 pounds each, so we were doing a full bag of coffee every roast we did. And when I had the opportunity of doing the same coffee back to back, I did one the way we usually did it, and then I tried another Willem's way. And what I found interesting was that you could actually lighten up the roast and it would taste better. So when I presented it to some of the people I worked with, our agtrons levels our target Actron levels immediately went up 3 points. Okay? Now, if you're not familiar with what an Actron is, it's a machine in which you set your coffee in a little petri dish, and you set it on the machine, and it measures the amount of light which is reflected back into the machine. So a lower number would indicate a darker level of coffee. A higher number would indicate a lighter roasted coffee. And so let's say 20% light came back. That would indicate an extremely dark roasted coffee. Let's say 80% got reflected back. That would be an extremely light roast, okay? We didn't ever go that dark or that light. I think our darkest coffee, the ground Actron, was more like a 38, maybe a 36 ground Actron. And roasted light, I think the lightest we had back then was maybe 65%. Okay? Now, there's so much I could say about Actron. I don't want to talk too much about it right now. When I start roasting for other companies and I realized they didn't have Actrons, it made me nervous. It made me think, how are we going to measure our consistency? And I realized after a while that you don't really need an Actron, okay? That's when I started doing more profile roasting and sticking to that. What we were doing at the first place I worked at was you take a bag of coffee, essentially 132 pounds or 60K, dump it into the roaster, and pretty much charge the roaster, walk away, and just let it roast because it was going at full speed the whole time. And at a certain point, maybe a couple of minutes before the roast was done, we would hear an alarm go off to indicate that we need to get over to the roaster, and then we would look at the beans and finish it out. And that's what we called our development, bean development. And once we saw or smelled what the beans were like, close enough to what our target Actron was, then we would let it out, and then we would go through it again. So there was actually very minimal attention given from roast to roast. Now, I really wish, I roasted there for a couple of years, and I really almost felt like I wasn't actually doing anything as a roaster. I realize now that there are a lot of advantages to roasting that way. One, your weights are the same from roast to roast, so you're going to be consistent. The good thing about it is you're minimizing your variables from roast to roast. And so you know what to expect. You don't have 20 pounds here, 40 pounds there, 60 pounds, and that's going to affect what the instruments are reading and how it roasts. But doing it a full bag each time, it really made things a lot easier. However, like I said, I didn't feel like I was really learning the craft of roasting coffee. I didn't get that until I moved over to another roaster, which was a lot smaller, and we didn't have the luxury to just roast a full bag of coffee each time. So that really changed things, and I really learned a lot more about manipulating my burner and adjusting it higher for bigger roasts. And like I said, I really learned how to hone my craft in from roasting that way. Let's not get too far off subject. Like I said, be open, be skeptical. There are a lot of questions I would ask people in the business about roasting coffee, and how does this roaster compare to this other machine? And for instance, let's go with in Roast Magazine, this past issue, there was an article called Baked Beans, and it was just talking about how to avoid that quality that we don't want in our coffee, where the coffee tastes dried out and it tastes baked. We like our coffees to taste nice and juicy, right? So they did an experiment where they measured how much water was coming out of the roaster, how much was being, going through the exhaust. And I thought there were some things about that were really interesting. One of the things is that it seems that most of the weight that you lose is actually water. I mean, I think it was around 99% is water, which tells me a lot about that minuscule amount that is not water. That's where you probably are getting some of the bakiness coming out. And I want to see more research done on this. Now, there's different things I've heard over the years about what causes baked beans. I've heard electric roasters roasters with recirculated air will tend to bake coffee out more. What I heard was that roasting with a gas roaster produces a heat which is less dry and more wet. So you're going to want to have a good flame roaster, one with a gas burner, as opposed to a roaster on electric heat for that reason, or a roaster that doesn't recirculate air. I used to believe that. I mean, I believed it for years. But the more I go away from the time I was told that, the less I believe that, because I've actually seen electric roasters like the ILEO that seem to do just fine using electricity. And it really got me thinking, well, for one thing, I don't think that correlation implies causation. I mean, we all know that. So the thing is that most people, they make observations, they see patterns, and they will leap to conclusions. And they may have a system that works for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the way they're thinking of it is actually what's going on in the coffee roaster, okay? So, let me think of an example here. All right, development time. Okay, there's something that we used to call development time when I first started roasting coffee. And now, what they meant by that was strictly the time after first crack. Okay, that's what they call development time. So once the beans start cracking at, let's say, I don't know, let's say at 9 minutes, 30 seconds into the roast, you might have a 4-minute development time, you might have 4.5-minute development time, you might have 5 minutes of development time. And a lot of that just changed depending on what you're trying to achieve. No one back then thought of a development time of anything like 2 minutes. That was just crazy, okay? That is until Scott Rao came along, okay? And he essentially made observations and recorded data for years and years and years. And he would make a note of the coffees that were the best coffees that he tasted. And he looked at all that and he realized that it was those coffees with a development time between 75%, or let's say 20 to 25% of the total roast time that seemed to be the best coffees, okay, excluding dark roasts, excluding espresso roasts, okay? So we're speaking strictly of drip coffee, okay? And after you notice a pattern like that, then you might start thinking there's something to it, and I do think there's something to that, okay? So I tried to stick to those parameters. I want my time after first crack to be between 20 and 25% of the total roast time, all right? Now, I don't think that Scott Rao goes so far as to say why that is, okay? He's just saying that this seems to be a correlation, but he's not saying that there's any causation to it. And I think that's an honest way of communicating these findings, okay? Here's another thing, like Scott Rail will talk about the drying phase, and he says that that phase, it's actually maybe, what do you call it? It may be misleading to call that the drying phase. And if you look at the Roast magazine in which they talk about baked beans and the data they measure, they actually seem to confirm that it's not really a drying phase, okay, as we might think of it. The way I was taught was once you got up to, let's say, around 300, 320 degrees Fahrenheit, all the water in that coffee has been evaporated out. And then we get to what Scott Rail would call the nameless middle phase, which he thought was not given the respect that it really should be given. And I agree with him on that. And if you look at the Baked Beans article in Roast magazine, they will show you that really we are losing water all through the so-called drying phase, through the so-called nameless middle phase, and the most water that you're losing is right when first crack begins to occur. That's when you're losing the most water. And that makes sense to me. Okay? It makes complete sense. Because that's when the beans start to crack, then the water is going to find a way out of the beans, and you're going to lose a lot of water. In fact, Scott Rail will talk about how there's so much water vapor being lost that it actually causes a cooling effect to the coffee, and your rate of rise is going to be in danger of crashing at that point. And if you want to continue having a steadily declining rate of rise throughout your roast, you're going to want to know when that's going to occur in your roast and to compensate for it before it actually occurs. Because if you don't, you might start baking out your beans. Okay, we're back to baked beans. So that's my main thing I'm saying. Be open. Be skeptical, okay? There's a lot of advice you're going to hear. That's part of the reason why I'm doing these videos, is because I want to talk about these things. 15 years ago, a lot of the things that were told to me, it's not that I didn't question them, but I trusted what everyone told me. And there's a lot of reason to trust, because they had a system that you could follow, and you could get consistent results from these systems. However, that doesn't necessarily mean we understood what was going on scientifically in the beans. As time goes on, we learn more, and we get to act upon that knowledge more and more, and that's great. However, it's really important to keep an open mind and be skeptical at the same time of everything everything you hear, okay? Now, I think there are other things I could follow, or I could follow up with here. I don't want to make this video too long, so we'll just end it right here. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and please comment below, because I want to hear what you guys have to say. I want to tell you guys things that you're interested in. So that's why your feedback is really important, because this is a service to you guys. All right. Anyway, please, subscribe, share, and because that helps the channel grow, get more people in the conversation, and we all get to learn. Okay. And until next time, happy roasting, happy brewing, happy sipping, and good night. Thank you.